everybody. Welcome to another ASFP Sparking Interest podcast. Today I'm joined by Joe Cilia from the FIS, that's the Federation of Interior Specialists, and we're going to be talking about quite a complex subject matter that actually has some relatively simple solutions to it, as long as we effectively understand what those problems are and follow the rules. So the ASFP has a series of member groups. Our manufacturing members are made up of two groups effectively, and there's a clue as to why I'm sort of explaining this to you now. So our members manufacture products, and some of our members manufacture systems. And the difference between a product and a system is generally a product is something like a fire-rated mastic or something that you would bring together and combine with a series of other products to achieve a finished result. Whereas a system is a manufactured system from a series of component parts. It's tested as that system and sold as a system. So typical examples of that would be a fire door set, a smoke damper or fire damper set, or a finished fire curtain, which effectively, so these products are finished products and they are interfaced with the building structure. So one of the areas that is a bit of a grey area that sort of merges between those two considerations is dry lining walls, and what the consideration is as to when you consider a dry line wall as a series of component parts and when a dry line wall should be considered a finished article or a system, I think is probably the best way to describe it. So, hello Joe, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm all right. I like the sparking interest
podcast.
I think
yes,
I've got to go away now and find a similar thing for our sector.
It is, and I must admit, one of our the best strapline I ever saw, and one of our members has got it. He was at the fire safety event, and it was, and I can't remember the name of the company, and I do forgive you for not remembering who you are, or rather forgive me for not remembering who you are. But they had a thing on their stand where you could try out actually doing a bit of bat and board.
I saw that.
Yeah, and they had this phrase on the top of it that said "passive makes perfect," and I thought, if only we'd have thought of that one, but somebody else did. So unfortunately, so passive makes perfect. I'm sure they'll tell us who they are. They'll pop up somewhere. So today we're going to have a quick walk through dryline systems, by virtue of the fact that there's a general groundswell that a finished dryline system made up of component parts should be considered a system and not a collective of component parts.
Yeah, there's that, and I want to take it on to the next stage. I'm actually going to turn around something that you started off by saying, because I think it's a fairly simple system, fairly simple product, but it's the complexities of it that we want to try and draw out in what we're doing. So my role at FIS is to try and provide answers to the complex questions, the technical questions that we get. They're dominated at the moment around the complexities and the granularity of what we're doing. I'm getting far more granular questions about evidence of performance particularly is a big thing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about us as well. So FIS represents the finishes in the interior sector. That's where FIS actually comes from. So a bit like you, we have manufacturers and distributors and contractors. So having that integrated network of people, we're able to deal with the issues from a manufacturer's point of view, but also when it comes to the actual installation. And that's perhaps sort of one of the gaps that we get with this, about should we be treating walls as a system. I think the problem is that we treat them very much as just a wall.
Yeah.
We treat them in isolation and not realising actually what we're doing. So that, for example, the one of the shots that I used at the last presentation that we did with you at the fire safety event was a wall in a cinema. And you start to think about, well, what's that wall in a cinema actually got to do? You don't want to hear the fight at the OK Corral next door when you've got a romantic scene in your cinema, so sound is important, fire is important, but also the structural stability of that product as well, the crowd pressures that you might get. So it's not just about just a wall. How it interacts and how it works and how it meets the performance requirements for the project as well. One of the things that I come across so often, there's a couple of words that I really want to get out of the English language. If I could scratch them out completely, one would be soundproof.
Yeah.
And you can guess the other one.
Yeah.
Fireproof.
Fireproof.
Right?
Yeah.
Soundproof, fireproof, no proof. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And there's a misconception actually in the market, especially around dry lining, that there's such a thing as a half-hour fire-rated plasterboard.
Yeah.
Google it when you when you finish this.
Yeah.
Google it out.
So when you say plasterboard, you're talking about a sheet, an 8x4.
You're showing your age now.
And we can use Imperial. We can use Imperial. We're old enough to be allowed to use Imperial, Joe. An 8x4 sheet of pink. Other colour boards are available, but effectively for generic purposes, an 8x4 sheet, a pink board, is not half hour in its that state of just being an 8x4 piece of board. No,
it's not. It relies on being part of a system.
Yeah.
You know, otherwise you could say, well, this is a half-hour stud or it's a half-hour screw. It isn't. So that's where the system comes in. For that case, purely about a product. So let's leave aside, because this is ASFP. So let's leave aside the other performance requirements of a wall, acoustic, airtightness, and all of the other things. When we look at the fire performance, and even that can be divided into two, can't it? So many people think it's fire, isn't it? It's just we've got reaction to fire.
Yep.
So reaction to fire is important in its own line, and that's part of it.
Because I think some people don't understand that actually certain materials or components of products can actually add to the propagation and the load of the fire as the fire develops.
Yeah. So that's why we're seeing non-combustible, certainly in exterior walls. We're seeing that right the way down to the granularity of things like plastic cavity trays. The plastic ones are banned on SFS in England. Funnily enough, in Scotland, you can use them. The new regulation allows you to use them. Makes sense, but perhaps has been an overreaction on what you can do and you can't do, right down to plastic membranes. What that would add to the fire load, it could be argued. But of course, we had this huge, everything had to be A1. Everything had to be A1. And then they went, we've got all these balconies, and guess what, they're catching fire.
Yeah.
So let's deal with the big stuff. That granularity of it, sometimes there is a bit of an overreaction to it. So if we look at straightforward fire resistance of a wall itself, there's a whole number of tests, whether it's load bearing, whether it's non-load bearing, whether we're using the British BS standards, the 476 series, or whether we're moving across to the European standards. There's much more of a move across. I have seen that of late to
and that's going to create challenges in its own right, of course, because of UK CA and what those equivalent, what the equivalent of a BSCN eventually looks like.
Well, that's an interesting point actually about CE marking and UK CA marking, because the 476 and the 1363 tests, they're not harmonised.
No.
They're not designated standards. So it's a point that I'm going to cover a little bit later on about how and why you could. The boards themselves are marked. The studs are marked.
Yeah.
Same way as a hinge is marked on a fire door, but like the fire door itself isn't.
No.
So we've got these gaps. We've got further to go. So the test is quite brutal. You have a framework. It's 3 metres by 3 metres, what we used to call 10 foot by 10 foot.
Yeah.
And you build your sample in that. There's some details. One end's got to be a free end so that you can continue to build it. and you crane that in on the front of a furnace, and then you set the furnace alight.
Yep.
Oh, the other thing that you do, you put thermocouples on it.
Yeah.
Because it's not just that the fire mustn't break through, so you mustn't get gaps, you mustn't get smoke that can ignite a cotton wool pad, but the temperature curve has got to be within a certain curve as well.
Yeah.
So it's got to do an awful lot.
Yeah.
So we do that, and what do we do when we get on site? What do we do when we build it? The first thing that we do is go, oh, so you know that lovely imperforate wall?
That perfect thing that was 3 metres by 3 metres.
Exactly.
That performed so well for 4 hours or 2. I mean, 4 hours generally is bragging rights. It's 4 hours under British and 2 under EN. But from my experience of fire testing, of course, you would go as long as you could, because, of course, if you needed to apply for extended applications of width and height, the longer you'd gone, the greater the size you could probably go beyond the original test sample. It's that perfect thing. I know what you're going to say. Someone's going to stick a load of holes in it now.
Stick holes in it. So buildings have to breathe.
Yeah.
Right. So they have to have ventilation. They need to be able to deal with waste. They need to get services around it as well. And of course we're in a digital age, aren't we? Yeah. So we still got to have wiring that goes around it. We need power that goes through it. Yeah.
Actually, interesting though, we did a survey a few years ago. Excuse me. We did a survey a few years ago, and we're trying to establish the most difficult building type to apply the disciplines of passive fire to, and hospitals came out top purely because of the huge amount of services that run through them.
Thousands,
including things like compressed air.
Yeah.
And you've got challenging rooms. The rooms where they do all that stuff, where they stick you through a big donut. Radiography, I think they call it. And hospitals come at top by virtue of the fact that they have more services and penetrations and equipment, M&E equipment running through them than any other typical type of building.
And some of them as well, some of the clean rooms, they're looking at air permeability as well.
Yeah, clean rooms is interesting actually. I do profess to having some experience with clean rooms, and the thing about a clean room is, of course, it's an environment in another environment. Because of course the whole, GlaxoSmithKline may have a clean room on the 10th floor of a tower block in London or New York. The rest of that tower block may just be a normal building. So clean rooms are very interesting. And of course, there is a separate the clean room industry has an industry all of its own, and most of their time seems to be spent looking at how you can clean down the room after you've finished doing something in it and maybe want to change your use, or how you're creating different environments within those spaces.
It's particulates in the air as well.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the testing regime was about certain things that were had to operate in a clean room. It had particulate discharge. It was the size of the particulate. Yeah. The how many per square meter I think it was at the time, and then how this thing could be cleaned down, and the materials it was made of, how they reacted to the different detergents and various other cleaning solutions that they would use to clean the rooms down.
Do you know one of the hardest roles I think at the moment, Mike, for anybody is that the role of the specifier and the designer.
Yeah,
I used to work with architects, and I realised fairly on that I had more questions when I was talking to them than they had the answers to, and they do rely on industry experts to help them to write those specifications. But to be fair to them, they've got to know an awful lot about town planning, drainage systems, everything that goes around in being an architect as well. So they do rely on these people. My background was specification work. So we've just produced 2 new guides on specifying partitioning and dry lining, as well as one on ceilings and one on SFS. And even after doing all that work that I did over years, when we had a group of people together looking at it, you still learn something new.
Oh yeah.
And the key is the question. Yeah. It's not the answer, it's the question. So the standards, all of these standards that we've just started to touch on, are enormous. So where we've got this issue of this imperforate wall in a test, so that's the test evidence that everybody's looking for, the granular detail of that. We stick all of these holes through it. The question is, how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, because of course the test, the documentation that supports that wall system doesn't now support it because that thing's now got holes in it. And so therefore the test report doesn't represent how that wall or that partition system ends up. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that anyone is faced with in terms of
maybe
systems.
now would be a good time to.
Yes, let's conveniently just remove. We'll just move the new May issue of Ignite magazine out of the way for you to get hold of that.
This little property. This this was something that I had the pleasure of working on.
Yeah.
But working on with a whole group of people.
Mm.
So Andy and Niall. Two names that you might know quite well.
Yes, so Andy is the FIS technical officer, and Niall is the regulatory affairs officer.
Huge amount of work on this, and they were at the initial meeting of this. And boy, do you know, we thought initially this would be a really easy thing to do. It was a chap called Matt Sexton who started off on this camp, and he said, we've got this problem with all of these letterboxes. It should be quite easy, shouldn't it? Mm. What we do is, if we tell you tell us what's going through it, we'll tell you the size of the letterbox and how to stop it. That'll just be a matrix. We could do that in a few weeks. That was the idea. About 2 and a bit years later.
Yeah.
And just look at the size of it that we've got here. A lot of process in this. It's guidance like this actually that architects, designers, contractors actually need to get this. And I think you can get this directly from your website, can't you?
You can, yes. Yeah, it's available off the website, and it does get downloaded. I think it is one of our most, besides the Red Book, which is the guidance doc for fire stopping.
Yeah.
That one I think is probably one of the most popular ones.
So one of the things that I remember the first time that I met Niall was that he had all of these slides about where stuff can go wrong.
Yeah.
I think he called it fire stopping porn.
There could be other words for it,
but
I think I suppose in Niall's world it possibly could be described as that.
But it's the pink foam, isn't it?
It is, yes. Yeah.
Huge hole. I'll tell you what we'll do. That's got fire on it. We'll stick that in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to think that we're seeing less of that, but I'm seeing as much of it still.
I think you've got to look at the sectors. So are we seeing less of it in the commercial sector, where possibly people are becoming more educated? I don't know, because we don't have the measure, because we've not asked the question, I suppose. But you might want to assume that as the commercial sector becomes more intelligent, because it has to, it's going to have to follow improving its competency, and not only that, but evidencing its competency. I think possibly the risks are more in the sort of domestic residential side, where maybe you have somebody like an electrician or a plumber or somebody punching a couple of holes in a wall, and then don't realise that you've just put 2 holes through a fire rated system, separating element, and you don't make good. Because you don't know that you need to make good, because you only you don't know what you don't know effectively.
No, that's perhaps one of the sort of the big issues. Max, you can edit this, can't you?
Yeah.
You can edit it as we're going through.
Or we can keep it in.
Keep it in.
Could keep it in. Stick it in the Christmas bloopers.
Depends on that.
We'd like a bit of that.
I mean these podcasts. I mean the people watching this know that the stylisation of these podcasts is quite relaxed. There's no formality to it.
Yeah, I was wondering actually where the green room was.
No, there's no green, and there's no rider either.
Isn't there?
No, we don't stretch to. Our members wouldn't appreciate us spending their money on bottles of champagne and.
So this again came out of a conversation with Niall and I years ago. Exactly that problem. So you've got your wall, it's been built, it works. Somebody lifts a tile 2 years later and goes, we need to get a pipe through there.
Yeah.
They just see it as a wall.
Yeah.
They're not seeing it as a firewall. So I want to get rid of soundproof, fireproof, but I want to replace those two with firewall.
Yeah.
If we can get the term firewall into the lexicon, I think that will help. People will start to understand it. But there's no way of actually, you lift a tile, you look at a gap, you go, well, it's okay, it's not been painted above the ceiling, but surely I can just, you tap it, it's hollow, I can get something through there to do it. So, I don't know how well this will pick up on the camera, but there is a QR code there And what I'd suggest you do while you're watching, get your phone out,
That's it.
have a look at the QR code. As that. Have a look at the QR code and follow it, because that will give a piece of advice that takes us straight back.
And there is information available on that labelling system on the ASFP website as well.
This is a completely joint initiative, and it's between three trade associations.
Yeah, it is.
So ASFP, FIS, and the GPDA. They're the people that make the draft.
The GDPA is the
Gypsum Product Development Association.
That's right. I did. It was like you, Joe. My head is full of acronyms, and I couldn't, for the life of me, for a second there. As soon as I looked at GDPA, I thought my mind's gone blank. So thank you for saving me on that one. Apologies, GDPA. I do know who you are. I just couldn't remember the definition of your acronym.
Do you know, that's the great thing that I found about trade associations.
Yeah.
Actually, we're all serving our different sectors, but there's common ground on all of this.
Yeah, because most trade associations represent products or industries or service provision where they butt up against somebody else's products, service provision, trade association.
Yeah.
Because, of course, that's actually, certainly in construction, that's what happens in buildings, isn't it?
Yes.
All the bits come together to form a finished building. Well, that means that all the products, services, and their respective trade associations come together in some harmonised way.
Where I don't think it is coming together, if you like, the elephant in the room, is how we put these products together then in a building.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So we've now got a system. We've got a wall system. There's a floor system. There's a slab system. There's a heating system. But actually, it's the integration of all of those systems to actually make the wall count, which is important. Andy and I talk several times a week because there's commonality, and one of the areas we've got is this intersection, the interface. Just because the wall itself is there, but what happens when it butts something?
Yeah.
That way. How is that going to react? So the most common at the moment is putting your firewall up along a compartment line, which is actually on a beam, steel beam. So the steel beam needs to be protected. The most common way of protecting it at the moment is using a reactive coating.
That's an intermescent
That's
coating, so it expands on a certain temperature and creates a thermal barrier, I suppose, through those tiny little air pockets that
it insulates it.
It insulates
the whole thing, which means that the heat doesn't get to it, and you maintain that structural stability for a period.
Because I think a lot of people don't realise actually steel will deform at possibly sooner and at lower temperatures than they may realise.
Yeah. So you have the protection of the people, but likewise, you don't want the building to collapse.
No.
And that you don't want the building to collapse either the people who are escaping, but more importantly, the firefighters who have come into.
I think and that's another thing to emphasise is that if you talk to insurance companies, it's all about property protection.
Yeah.
But predominantly, from the ASFP's point of view, it's two things. It's protecting means of escape, therefore protecting life, protecting the ability to egress, and it's protecting the first responders to ingress into the building and fight the fire safely.
Yeah.
And for us, those are two primary disciplines. I'm sure it's not that we don't care about somebody's property, but property can be replaced, contents can be replaced, lives cannot.
No.
And that's why we see it as a very important thing.
So that intersection with the beam itself, and not affecting or impacting the reactive coating to expand, but then the beam itself, if it's on a compartment line, there'll also be acoustic requirements and thermal requirements and transfer.
Yeah.
So the answer quite often is to encase it, provide an encasement to it too. But even there, when you talk to different experts, they'll have their own views about how that can be done. And this comes down to the overall designer of these projects. Quite often the designer has to take that responsibility, because they're the only people that can understand all of these intersections, all of these interfaces and actually how they go together. So what's required each time is that degree of evidence. Normally, it's test evidence and understanding how that goes. I did a comparison because I was looking at where else have we got systems that are now treated as systems, and to me it's fire doors. So first of all, we call them fire doors. We don't call them doors, do we? We call them fire doors. We call them for what they are.
There's two terms of terminology. I think there's a door set and a door assembly. I think they're very different in terms of the consideration. So a door set is a finished, constructed door frame, everything built, and you insert that finished article into the opening. Door assemblies is a collection of parts that you build on site, and therefore you're possibly risking the fact that you don't replicate the sample that was originally tested in terms of its quality or its configuration. And there is one beyond that, which is it's beyond an assembly, which is that the builder sources local, gets the chippy on the site to build the frame. Therefore, the frame actually isn't the tested frame. No. The hardware is not the hardware that was tested. Therefore, you swap out the well-performing, albeit expensive German, for example, fire hardware for something that possibly someone sourced from a local ironmonger's. So there's three stages to this. I think the term door set, as we're talking about, is something that I think the industry is probably looking to try to move towards away from individual components, because as you're talking about, you end up with the same dichotomy. It's the consideration of bringing together component parts, as opposed to saying actually once it's installed it is considered a set or a finished item.
I think that the contractors that do that break down and go, oh, well, I can get a cheaper door frame, I'll do it myself. I don't think they realise that actually they become the designer. Yeah, they do. They carry that design responsibility because they're the fabricator, they're manufacturing.
Instead of just interfacing a finished system with the building structure, therefore the only thing they have to worry about is the interfacing of it.
That should be it. That should be as simple as that. So I like the idea of looking at the anatomy of a fire door and understanding that all of the components around it now, they're tested together. Yeah. They should be sold together, assembled together.
Absolutely.
Actually makes sense. And I like this idea as well that we put fire before a number of things. Fire doors, fire seals, fire glass, fire dampers, fire curtains. Fire stopping. I want to get this term fire wall into the market, and I think that makes sense. But when you start to look at the anatomy of a fire wall itself, you have all of these perforations that are going through it. So the first one is the simple one, it's a door. You would think it's simple, wouldn't you? But it depends on how the door frame then sits against the flexible wall, that interface with the supporting structure. Is it going to have an architrave, or is it going to have one of these quote shadow details? Is the partition itself, is it lined or unlined? So some of the manufacturers. So it comes back to that test evidence to make sure that you've got there. Or if you're putting a riser door in a shaft wall, have you got evidence for it in a shaft wall construction rather than a partition construction? And the other thing is that a riser door is likely to be non-symmetrical. It's an asymmetrical door.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you tested it from both sides, opening out and opening in as well? A lot of people forget that as a part of
I've seen historically on sites where they'll make the riser doors on site just to cover the hole.
Yeah. I hope we'll start to see less of that. But the other thing about the wall, of course, is we're back to all of these perforations.
Yeah, and which is now different to the tested sample.
They can be different to the tested sample in terms of shaft wall and a partition system. Evidence of that is important as well. What type of services are going through, what the proximity of the holes that you're cutting in the wall as well, because you can't butt two holes up side by side. You need depending on the manufacturer and their evidence, 200 or 300 mil space between
Separation,
them, between the soffit, because the soffit's also got to deal with deflection. So all of those things have got to be taken into account. And remember as well, it's partial penetrations as well as full penetrations. So socket boxes.
Yeah.
You need to deal with how you're going to deal with the back of that as well. How you're going to abut the structure. So if you're fitting up to a mullion, how do you ensure that the mullion, the window mullion, back to the glazing we were talking about earlier, how do you make sure all of that sort of sits together as well? So this is one of my next projects, and we'll be working very closely with ASFP, and we're going to be working very closely with a number of partners who are Tier 1 contractors and manufacturers, and a whole group now of subject matter experts have just got around the table to look at the evidence around passive fire and what evidence is available. So the group is going to be called the Passive Fire Knowledge Group. And the purpose of the group is to understand the interface with all of these different elements, but also to understand where there are gaps in test evidence. And as a group, what we can do to try and get that gap, but also what best practice can we put out there, either in terms of process or information. So I'm going to be working closely with ASFP again as we develop that over the next few years, because I can't see this being an instant thing that we're going to solve.
No, I think it's like a lot of these things. They start with for the right reasons. They start for a series of reasons that then develop other reasons, and then there's more reasons that come, and it extrapolates to a point that, like you say, you're 2 years in and you suddenly realise that you may finish soon, but there will be a journey to go on. And also, of course, that there's going to be a slight shift in the key stakeholders in that type of conversation, which of course is main contractors, where I'm not saying they're normally at arm's length when it comes to these types of groups, but they're normally seen to sort of leave it to the experts per se.
With this, it's actually the other way around.
Yeah, well, I think
it really is the other way around.
And I think that's probably, it's like a lot of things, of course, that came off the back of the Hackett report, and now the fire safety bill, is that people now have to. You cannot assume somebody else is responsible.
No.
Certainly in terms of principal designer, principal contractor. I know fire safety managers have been removed for reasons known to them. That's still something a lot of our members are talking to us about as to why that was removed. I'm sure they have their reasons for it.
I think the responsibility is going to be there in one form or another.
Yeah.
I think it was the tenants particularly, because you could have a block and say, okay, we need a fire safety manager on this block, and it's going to cost them £50,000 a year just to have somebody,
and also, of course, somebody that maybe doesn't foot the bill, apply belt and braces to everything, and each of the residents gets a £25,000 a year bill for, by virtue of the actions of somebody that
they've been hit so badly in all of this, haven't they? And without them, their sort of understanding.
No, that's right. Yeah, and I think that for anybody that lives in one of these apartments that has a shared responsibility through a management scheme, and of course, if you look at the demographic of the people that buy these apartments, they're normally first-time buyers. Therefore, they're not going to have huge amounts of spare cash hanging around. They're probably literally bankrupt. Broke themselves to save up, get the mortgage. Certainly, if you're living in the south of England, your mortgage will be, more than the national debt of some, most small countries. Everyone's gas and electric's going up. Council tax is going up. People's national insurance has gone up, and yet these kids who are like in their mid-20s, who are still struggling to get on the property ladder, suddenly get hit with a £30,000 bill for getting rid of dead pigeons out of the gutter.
You're just so right.
So
I think there is hope now. So it's 5 years almost, Mike, since
it's the anniversary soon, isn't it? Yeah,
almost 5 years.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where I certainly remember exactly where I was on holiday in the Lake District, and we came back because I said to my wife, this is going to change stuff.
Yeah.
And I think what people fairly have been asking is, so what's changed? Where's the change? So the change for us is, I can't call it a bill anymore because it's gone through Parliament, the Building Safety Act 2022.
Yeah.
It's not published yet. It's there. It's given us a direction to travel. And I think the big change is going to be the way in which evidence needs to be put forward as part of the design earlier.
Yeah.
We talk so often, don't we, about design and build. The reality is we build and design. We start the process and then we deal with the stuff. We know in our sector, with dry lining, for example, the rework, simply because not all of the information was there to start with, is 17%.
Within dry lining?
Just in dry lining.
So your members, 17% of their work is rework based on the fact that designs were either incorrect or they've changed or there was a change of the design by the client or somebody else.
So let's go back to the Oxgang school.
Yeah.
There was a late change in a bracing piece of steel, which meant that the cavity between the walls was increased, but nobody ordered longer brick ties.
Mm-hmm.
There was a failure in the process of inspection, and whoever laid the bricks just went, we'll just put them up. What they also found on that job, of course, was when they started to look at the fire stopping and the penetrations, in many cases there was none.
Yeah. It was a floating wall with a massive void behind it, wasn't it?
So we've got a series of gateways now, where gateway 1 is for all of the planning. That's go on the board. You can't get past gateway 2 until all of that information now is available. Yeah. Digitisation, digital information, this golden thread that we've talked about.
And I think
Judith has.
I think it's clear to emphasise where that burden sits, because historically architects are the principal designer in many cases, and they affect having design responsibility, because actually their role is to do the due diligence within the design itself, and that obviously then gets passed down to whoever the awarded contractor is. I think it's interesting to touch on this design and build concept, because we have design and build, and as you rightly said, that quite often we build as we go, outside of the design. Design and build as a concept, I think, was fine as a principle when you were building tin sheds, distribution centres, and your Tesco's down the road. But of course, like all of these things, they migrate into other areas of the industry, and all of a sudden you find that actually a highly complex, highly architecturally driven building, you get onto site and they say it's design and build. And you think, how has this got to become a design and build? There should be an architect resident on site. There should be a clerk of works resident on site. Your LABC or AI inspector should be there every other day to make sure that actually, and not only what the client is paying for is what they're getting, but that actually the design and the due diligence that originated from the person with design responsibility is respected in terms of putting the thing up.
So we had a webinar yesterday on from Jeff Wilkinson, who was talking about the building regs as well, and he said actually, although we are the building inspectors and we're there to make sure that what's being proposed meets the requirements, they're actually not they're not the people responsible.
No, they're not.
And that was a bit of a sort of a shock to me. So it comes back to, who is the designer? Who is that person who is going to be responsible? And that's why we've got a principal designer. That's why we've got principal contractors. That's why we've got this golden thread of information, which is not. Somebody said that's just O&Ms, isn't it? And it isn't. The O&M is the operation manual that you give at the end of the job.
Your folders in
it's maintenance. It's not that. This is the upfront information about, have I got evidence for that interfacing with that to do that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things people misunderstand, or maybe don't understand about the golden thread, everyone's talking about training, training course for this, training course for that. Part of the golden thread, actually, it is competency. That the industry needs to up itself in competency, but actually more importantly, and this is where the golden thread comes in, it's the evidencing of the employees of a company's competency to carry out the works for which that company trades in.
I was wondering when that word was going to come
It's the
up.
evidencing of the competency.
Evidence of competence. So, what do we mean by competence? Okay, so much is down, I've got an MVQ2, I've got an MVQ3 in dry lining.
Yeah.
That doesn't make somebody competent.
No.
Because you need to have that knowledge to develop the skills,
Yep.
backed up with the experience of having done it several times,
Yeah.
and having the right behaviours.
Yeah. So it's SCEB, and some
It's
people
SCEB.
have heard of SCEB, which is skills, knowledge, experience, behaviour, and any individual one. So behaviour is always the net result.
Yeah.
So if you have the skills but not the knowledge and the experience, you may have a poor behaviour. If you've got no skills and the knowledge and no experience, that could generate a poor behaviour.
Yeah.
And if you've got experience but not necessarily formal skills or knowledge, that could create a poor. And actually, the experience equals behaviour one is the one that sort of we've seen the most debate around, because you could say to me, Mike, I've been doing dry lining, I've been creating these walls like this for 20 years, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
And I could say, yeah, Joe, I hate to tell you this, but you're actually doing it wrong.
You're wrong for 20 years.
You've done it wrong for 20 years,
Yeah.
because actually you started off here and you've ended here.
Yeah.
And, we all. I described my career path to somebody a long time ago that I've consistently failed upwards, and there's rhyme and reason to that, which I won't go into. And I still laugh at myself about it, because most of us consistently fail upwards, because most of where the reason why we are where we are at any point in time is generally more about luck than judgment.
Yeah.
We all consistently sort of fail upwards. So that person with the 20 years experience equaling a behaviour has probably consistently failed upwards for 20 years. They haven't gone through that formal process.
Mistake making is what we're built on.
Yeah, of course.
And if you don't make a mistake, you're not pushing the boundaries of what can be done. That's an important part as well.
Yeah.
But the other bit about competency, though, Mike, and competence and a person's competence, we're looking at the installers. So much has been on this on the installers.
Yeah.
So is an architect competent in specifying a petition? Because they might not have the skills or any of the other things that we've demonstrated on.
Mm.
So they may not be the right people to actually produce that specification.
No.
Is somebody on a trade counter competent in swapping out a mastic seal from one to another?
Yeah.
They might know the product, but they haven't got the experience.
Well, they won't know the application for it either, will they? I mean, somebody coming to a counter might say, the interesting. We did have a conversation on one of our podcasts. We had an ASFP member in who is a distributor, and quite a lot of the conversation was around the risk of entering the arena of design responsibility by virtue of giving advice or swapping products out effectively over the counter.
Yeah.
And that does in itself pose quite a risk if they don't understand actually what's been asked, what product they need, and more importantly, and I think this is the one area that tends to get missed a lot is what's the application, what's the interfacing, what's the application. Because the application in a lot of cases can actually be more important than a couple of clicks further down the supply chain in terms of what the product is. I need a 60-minute fire rated this. Yeah. What do you want it for? Well, I just need to fill a hole. Okay, what's the hole? And if you don't understand, what's the substrate? Like you say, is it bearing load? Is it non-load bearing? Is it load bearing? If you don't understand the application, you may actually misspecify. And I think in relation to designers, most architects will spend 7 years achieving a Part 3. I mean, there's only dentists and vets that are 7 years as well. So, you can have your appendix whipped out by someone that's got 5 years, but if you want your dog neutering, you've got to wait for someone to achieve 7 years first. they tend to be, and I'm not being disparative in terms of page turners, but they will want to know about something when they turn the page and they're presented with it. So quite often, a lot of our manufacturer members will say, well, we get called to an architects to do a CPD. And I've got a lot of experience in this in the fire curtain industry, and you turn up at a practice in London, and the first question I used to ask is, who's working on a project that's got fire curtains on it? And you'd see 3 or 4 hands go up. And you knew the reason why you were there is they'd turned the page on this particular building and got to the fire curtain page, and they all looked at each other and said,
who knows?
We don't know anything about fire curtains. We better get someone in to give us a CPD.
That should be the case, but it shouldn't just be a CPD. The more that architects, designers actually go to the people that have got that level of competence about understanding the product, and definitely have the right behaviours for specifying as well.
Yeah,
that's the first port of call. We think
it has to be. I think it's principal designer. The principal, whoever is the principal designer, and what for the umbrella that the principal designer community falls under, whether that be architect, engineer, or see another. I think that whatever comes out of this, this now, it's an act, isn't it? Now I suppose it's
enacted. It's not published, but it is enacted. Yeah.
So whatever comes out of that, I'm sure, like the rest of the industry, they will have to affect change. I think the other important one for me, and certainly something that we've been looking at, is, and you touched on tier ones, is procurement. So we work and live in a world of specification. We as manufacturers, we toddle off and go and do a CPD. Hope that the architect specifies your product. It features in the bundle, ends up with the main contractor, and then the main contractor looks at the price of £100 a unit and applies the equal and or approved theory of everything to try and save, 20 quid and get them for 80 quid. And the question is how are people in procurement, whether that be a tier one if your relationship is direct with them, or that particular part is direct with them, or tier twos or threes, or specialist subbies that are maybe have got subbies under them. But anybody that is affecting procurement outside of the original specification by the company or person with design responsibility that should have gone through the correct level of due diligence, how are they without? And I did pose this question. I have posed this question historically, and it was to a trade association that has a predominance of tier ones as members in it. And I asked the question, without telling me it's a commercial decision, tell me how you're qualified to swap one product out with another.
Let's go back to the building safety.